Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. My co-host today is Bess Goden of the Millennial Splaining podcast. And our guest is the author who literally wrote the book on the Baltimore police cover-up of the Freddie Gray murder, Justine Barron. Justine, we're going to be talking about, how are you doing today?
Oh, great. Not really, but okay.
I know the feeling. That's how I am when I have to go to my day job. I get it. I've been waking up with migraines every morning lately during the week and feel a little better on Saturday, almost like it's a psychosomatic reaction to not having to work. You notice I say feeling better is psychosomatic and not physical.
That's capitalism for you. It keeps you just.
Well, no, I think it's really important, though, sometimes that we should realize our problems really are physical, and sometimes we just feel like we're feeling better.
That's true.
Yeah, mine aren't capitalism.
Well, capitalism's a problem, too. I won't deny that.
I wish I could blame capitalism for my migraine today, but I can't.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
I won't believe it. I know too much.
Well, we really appreciate you coming anyway, and surmounting your goals.
This is where I will say that our whole relationship as people with work is bound up in ideas that start with capitalism, but the problem is it doesn't matter where you start. Once you start thinking that people are only worth their labor, then that translates into other areas as well. Even though the root has a clear cause, you can't just get rid of it when you change the system. Yeah, and that's part of the problem.
Oh yeah, I mean that precedes capitalism.
Right.
But I'm getting off the subject now, and I'm sorry. So for people who so our topic today is the charges against Marilyn Mosby, who is the former DA of Baltimore and who has made the news lately because a piece was written in The Nation saying that Biden should pardon her. Around the same time that Justine broke into Slate, explaining the history of the case for people who maybe didn't know who Marilyn Mosby was or exactly what was going on. So start by summarizing for us, Justine.
And for me, please, because I actually don't know. I didn't do my research today. I'm so sorry about that. So I'm going to be like your cold react, and he'll be like your knowledgeable one.
So, in Baltimore, they call it the state's attorney, but it's the same function as the district attorney. She was elected back in 2015 is when she started. And a few months into her reign, Freddie Gray was killed. And she made national headlines and won a claim for prosecuting the officers in his death with very serious charges. She did not win any convictions. She was still held up as a hero. And then, on the national level, locally is a different story. And I'll get into that. So then during her second term, she was herself prosecuted for fraud and charges, like sort of these small time charges related to these mortgage applications. She claimed a COVID hardship to withdraw her own retirement account. And she was found guilty of that. And she was found guilty of claiming certain income so that she could get by these houses. So there are a lot of people, sort of like the Black elite, I would say, Black intellectuals, Black media, that believe she should be pardoned. And her claim had always been that her prosecution was vindictive and political. It started in the Trump administration. It started with this prosecutor, Leo Wise, who's now going after Hunter Biden, although she was found guilty by a jury. So, on the national level, the debate always tends to kind of fit into these binaries. And then when you go local, you find out, oh, things are much more nuanced and complicated. You know what I mean? For a lot of these political figures. So on the national level, people are saying, well, yes, it was politicized charges. They were small time. There really wasn't a precedent for claiming COVID hardship. You know, she said she believed that if she was just short a certain thousands of dollars from COVID, she could claim a hardship. And you know what? Maybe honest to God, there was no precedent for that claim. And also some people are saying it's her own retirement income. Like, is this really something that should face up to 40 or whatever years in prison, 20, 40, whatever it is, right? So, you know, I think that's fair, to be honest. And then there's the way in which she was prosecuted. You know, Leah Wise kind of announcing a year before he prosecuted her that she was under investigation, she and her husband, digging into her like finances to find these kind of obscure white lies that, I mean, just taking devil's advocate here, you know, you really have to look for that kind of thing, which means that you really are pursuing a prosecution without knowledge of a crime. Does that make sense? Okay.
It does. And it also, the thing that comes to mind when I listen to this is that there are a lot of, and I don't mean to excuse it by any means. I'm extremely anti-corruption, and this is a bad thing. But there are certain crimes that fall into the category of standard ruling class bullshit, which is basically everybody in power does this. And you really have to wonder sometimes when somebody is selectively targeted for breaking those laws that everybody breaks.
Well, yeah, and not just everyone in power. I mean, I can't imagine a lot of people didn't claim a COVID hardship where it was questionable, you know, because again, there was no precedent and the guidelines were incredibly vague, you know. So that's just laying out sort of two ways to look at it, you know what I mean, which is the surface. And then I have done, you know, been investigating her and Baltimore and her history and Leah Wise for many years. So I had a whole other level of, you know, in terms of talking about it. Okay. I go, on the one hand, I go deeper into her claims and like Leah Wise did pursue a large number of Black leaders in Baltimore for financial crimes. So he, by the way, had a history of this. He was in the Congressional Ethics Office. He was the first head of it. And he was going after Black Democratic leaders, like way disproportionately, to the point where he was asked to resign the Congressional Black Caucus. So there is something to be
seeing that. And that reminded me of Abscam back in the 90s, which was a federal sting to get Congress people who were breaking various campaign finance laws regarding investing campaign donations and things like that. And on the one hand, they were all genuinely guilty of bad stuff. And on the other hand, the prosecutors were only going after Democrats.
Yes. And I would say Leah Wise doesn't even necessarily have that level. With the mayor of Baltimore, the former mayor, he got her on this children's book scam you might have heard of, where she was selling her books, but actually just currying favor and political favor and money. That was sort of like next level. But a lot of what he goes after are things like what he went after for Marilyn Mosby. So it's not even always campaign violations. A lot of times it's just somebody didn't pay their taxes one year, you know, that kind of thing. He's a finance guy, and he has a habit of like targeting these. Now, he doesn't only go after Black people, but there is sort of this preponderance of especially prominent ones. And I think especially in the Marilyn Mosby case, there were other signs that she was being targeted, like that he had previously donated to two of her political opponents, that he was making statements about her office that were inflammatory. So I actually go a little further into that, but then I offer this other side, which is, who really is Marilyn Mosby? Is she actually this progressive hero? Did she actually prosecute the Freddie Gray case honestly and with commitment to overturn corruption? And the answer is no. The answer is that she has a history of her own vindictiveness, of her own cover-ups, of her own corruption and police protection. And so that's why locally there's not that much support for her, because, you know, the way I put it is that yes, she may be targeted by a vindictive prosecutor, but it's sort of just desserts because she's been historically a very vindictive prosecutor. She even a judge once called her out for vindictiveness.
Wow.
Please. That's something.
Yeah. So that's the multifaceted view of this case that's missing in the media, in my view.
And please forgive me if I'm wrong. I don't want to try to mischaracterize the writing, but the idea that I kind of got from the writing was that she did a half-ass prosecute the cops with tough charges to make the prosecutor look good, but not actually prosecute the case to win based on the actual facts and law and evidence.
Yeah, I mean, half-assed is almost giving them too much credit.
Fair.
It was corruption. Like, her office had evidence that he was killed by police force at the second van stop when they threw him headfirst into the van.
Yeah.
And, strategically kept it out of the trial, kept the medical examiner from knowing about it. And so the medical examiner had to come up with a different conclusion, which was this rough ride. Her office was participating at some level. I don't have all the answers, but like in a citywide decision to focus all the blame on the van driver. And so even though she did end up filing all these charges, yes, they half-assed it in court, but it wasn't sort of just like, oops, or not really trying. It was trying to cover up.
Yeah. So so all the credit for the prosecution is basically ignoring the fact that, well, the prosecution was never intended to be successful. It's just getting the story out there, basically.
You know what? I would believe that they wanted to be successful with their fraudulent case, at
Fair.
some level. I don't think that they were charging assault for a failure to seatbelt. Like, it wasn't logical, it wasn't accurate, it wasn't legal. It was show. But then they rushed the charges and they made this big announcement. And then rather than be lawyers and change their charges and get it right, they kicked all of the experienced prosecutors off the case. They had two political heads running the case who had no experience. And all of that was because they couldn't risk the truth coming out,
When covering up is more important than the prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of like, in some ways, Marilyn Mosby reminds me very much of just like your classic Democrat, where winning isn't the goal, but they don't want to necessarily lose. It's just not in the top 3.
Right. Yeah,
I'm not.
Because again, they take the same donations from the same donors as the other party does, right? Sometimes they don't lose.
Well, the thing that gets me, and this is the part I think gets ignored too much, is the consultants. The people the Democrats hire to tell them how to run their campaigns and what voters want.
Yeah, that's
the consultants the Democrats hire are themselves people who work for these big corporate think tanks when they're not working for the Democrats,
right,
and who are Republicans essentially in every way that really matters, and probably vote for the Republicans in actual elections, and then tell the Democrats, well, this is what people want from Democrats.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it is a conflict of interest.
I mean,
but it's how the Democrats want it to work right now.
Mm-hmm.
They have calculated and determined that votes are less important than, donations.
Absolutely.
It's not super new either. And it goes back, ironically, to places like Pennsylvania and Maryland and Delaware, where in 1972, and I'm going to use the 1972 example both because it's early and because it's topical right now. In 1972, the senior senator from Delaware was the Republican minority leader in the Senate, a man named Cale Boggs. Cale Boggs had co-sponsored the 1964 and 1968 Civil Rights Acts, had voted yes on all of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reforms, all of the the Kennedy era civil rights stuff that Lyndon Johnson got passed after Kennedy was assassinated. One of the real standout liberal Republicans of the 1950s and 1960s, top-notch left as far as anybody in politics at the time could possibly be. And in 1972, a Democrat county supervisor named Joe Biden runs against him from the right on the argument that civil rights reform has gone too fast for the suburbs. And the Democrats have been doing this ever since.
Yeah. And then when they have the majority, they say, well, it's not really a majority because these two people that we, very strongly backed and poured millions into their campaign and killed their progressive opponents aren't actual Democrats. That's my whole entire lifetime has been this 50, 50, 51. Oops, we don't really have it. Joe Lieberman goes back.
Ben Nelson, Joe Lieberman, Joe Manchin. There's always someone.
I don't think it's possibly an accident anymore.
And what's more important, your Ben Nelson, your Joe Manchin, your Joe Lieberman. They always consistently vote with the Republicans when it really matters.
Yes.
But the people on the Republican side that we compare to them, your Susan Collins, your Lisa Murkowski's, who we always look to somehow to save us when things get bad. How often do they actually vote their so-called principles in the Senate?
Mm-mm. Never.
They vote with their party because they know where their bread is buttered.
Mm-hmm. I think at one time, the Republicans were just really savvy and they were planting people in the Democratic Party to do this, right?
Yes.
And I would believe at that time, the Democrats were like, oops. But now the Democrats literally campaign for anti-abortionists. So I don't know.
Well, there's this classic.
You're absolutely right.
There's this classic moment. And I really do believe everybody's been trying to do the same thing ever since Bill Clinton got credit for it. Though it's actually something Joe Biden has been doing his whole career, which is why I mentioned his 1972 election. But Bill Clinton in the 90s, I think it was when he was running, he was either already president and it was a midterm or he was running for re-election. But he goes in front of a black audience at some place like the NAACP or some other institutionally black setting, and trashes a rapper named Sister Soulja for being too vocal about what people would call anti-whiteness and what's really just calling out anti-blackness.
Yes.
And people called it the Sister Soulja moment, where he supposedly got more popularity with black voters by calling them out for being too anti-white. And that's been something ever since that the Sister Soulja moment media coverage. Every Democrat has been looking for the chance to get good press coverage and be praised as someone moderate and serious and adult by saying, fuck you, you stupid fuckers, to their own core constituency.
Yep.
That's how it feels to me. But everybody wants that moment where they can really tell off their own constituency and get great press coverage.
And that's why Trump became so popular.
Almost. I mean, that's a big part of it because, in 2016, sometimes I wish I could go back in time to 2016 when the media was semi-honest about Trump in both good and bad ways, because now both sides just distort everything.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2016, Joe Scarborough, who's both extremely frustrating and an excellent judge of Beltway thinking in general, said honestly, truthfully, and I believe he was correct, that the reason that Trump won the presidential nomination running away in 2016 was because that Republican voters were tired of Republican candidates promising them homophobia and racism and misogyny and then not delivering.
Yeah.
You are so right. But
And he said this. He said they're tired of their politicians lying to them, and they're voting for someone who they believe is really going to do this stuff.
Yep. Absolutely.
But nobody can take that to the next level where maybe the Democrats need to run someone who will really do some of this stuff.
Oh my God.
So just to go back to Mosby.
Yes.
What she kind of represented during this whole era, both, end of Obama era and then the Trump era, was the progressive prosecutor model,
Yes.
and Larry Krasner, there's a few others. So I think she's always been in that pantheon, and
yes.
of them, she's probably in some ways the worst representative of it, because, well, I don't know enough about these other cities, but I don't hear what we know about Mosby. Mosby, after Freddie Gray was killed, prosecuted Keith Davis Jr., who was shot by police. He was a police brutality victim. And so in the Freddie Gray case, she went after the cops. And in this one, she went after him originally for a robbery. And then the cops pinned this fake murder on him. And she prosecuted him. She was going on 5 times, and then she started other charges. So he became, according to this one legal scholar, the most prosecuted man for one incident in American history. So that puts Marilyn Mosby as like a very poor representative of what gets called a progressive prosecutor. It was worse than Curtis Flowers, who was like in the deep South Republican prosecutor going after this guy a million times.
Yeah.
Worse than that. And so, but there's already this idea of like, can there be a progressive prosecutor, right? It's like the job of the prosecutor is to uphold this very like non-progressive system. But with Marilyn Mosby, and I've written about this elsewhere. I wrote about it for Fair once. She was sort of brilliant in one way. She didn't really care about local press, activists, any of that. She would make these big gestures to get national news to appear progressive. And a lot of times they were empty gestures.
Mm-hmm.
Like claiming that she won't prosecute marijuana after it was already decriminalized. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. Or they would be gestures, or they would be halfway gestures. She did a little bit that was progressive, but she was cultivating national press from the beginning to appear progressive. And that is why she has this support, because people who don't know really believed. And they remember, and she mentioned it when she was on Joy Behar, who's like always been a long supporter of her, that Trump said he was going to go after progressive prosecutors. So the people who are supporting her pardon now really do believe that all of this was about that. And I actually think Leo Wise, the guy who went after her, he was eventually taken out of his role and taken off the case because he was just so vindictive and intense. Like, I don't think he was doing that because of Trump. I think he was doing that because of Leo Wise.
Yeah.
Local politics. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's convenient that he's now going after Hunter Biden, because it does give the impression that he's that guy.
Yeah.
And, so then the people that are supporting Marilyn Mosby, it's like, well, never mind what the jurors thought.
There's a deep irony in the whole progressive prosecutor thing, in that, and I'm going to, and this is relevant because the guy who wrote the They Should Pardon Marilyn Mosby article in The Nation is a very good, very smart lawyer and writer named Elie Mystal, who writes lots of good stuff about the Supreme Court and really knows what he's talking about when it comes to a lot of national topics. But he's a guy from New York who thinks Kamala Harris was a progressive prosecutor.
Yeah.
Now, this goes to the root of the problem of what Justine was saying about the question of, is a progressive prosecutor even possible? Because the history of Kamala Harris's political career starts with a man in San Francisco named Terrence Hallinan. who was elected district attorney in the 1980s, on a really outspoken progressive platform. He said, and he was, to put him in context for people who don't know San Francisco in the 70s and 80s, Terrence Hallinan came from the same sort of political environment as Harvey Milk. He was someone who really believed a lot of the things that liberals said in the 60s and 70s and went out to try to make them really happen and got punished for it. And so he ran for district attorney on the premise that the district attorney shouldn't be prosecuting nonviolent victimless crime. And he completely stopped prosecuting any drug or sex work charges that did not have some sort of violent felony associated with them. And as a result, by the end of his first term, he had the lowest conviction rate of any prosecutor in the United States because, of course, the cops didn't stop bringing those cases just because they knew he wouldn't prosecute them. In fact, the cops brought more of these cases knowing he wouldn't prosecute them so they could complain that they weren't being supported by the prosecutor when an election year came around. And then Kamala Harris runs as the sort of chosen savior for the pro-growth, pro-gentrifier political machine in San Francisco, which is why it's so terrible when people talk about Kamala Harris being a progressive prosecutor. She was Brooke Jenkins before Brooke Jenkins. She was chosen to run against someone who was actually following through on a genuinely progressive agenda, which means a negative agenda. A genuinely progressive prosecutor is not prosecuting cases.
And actually, Marilyn Mosby, towards the end, did, back away from prostitution. I mean, she said, I think from what I hear from lawyers in Baltimore, it was very mixed with her because there would be these moments of sort of improving the system for the defense attorneys and their clients, but it wasn't consistent. It was often politicized. It was for her benefit. So in that way, and then there would be these sharp, reactionary moments, like Keith Davis Jr. So in that way, it was like, but then on the surface, she does seem like the one who's doing that too, But also part of what Marilyn Mosby did, was that because she really didn't seem to care about the local response so much as the national response, is that she wasn't coordinating a lot of her big moments with the police department, with the other things. So things didn't actually happen successfully because she was just so focused on the positive press. So, it's interesting when I'm thinking about Ely, is it Ely or Eli Mistel?
Ely Mistel.
Ely Mistel, got it. Who wrote I never said it aloud or heard it aloud. He wrote The Nation piece,
Yes.
Is that lawyers tend to have this view of these prosecutors, which is sort of like at least it's better, And
Yeah.
in some ways, at least it is better. In some ways, Marilyn Mosby is better. The person who ran against her, Ivan Bates, was going to free Keith Davis Jr., the man I told you about, free Adnan Syed from the Serial podcast. And so a lot of progressives got behind him. And in office, he's proved to be in some ways more conservative than her. So it's like, but in other ways not. Like, it's very mixed. But for lawyers, when you ask them, they really like to get behind this because they're in the system. And so
Yes.
And I kind of understand that. Like, I'm in media and journalism, and so much of it is just, I'm a critic of it. I write for FAIR. Like, so much of it needs to be demolished.
Well,
but inside of it, I might feel like at least this piece wasn't as pro-police. And so, I could almost excuse certain journalism that your average activist will be like, fuck all of them,
Well, I'll give you the perfect example. I'm an independent media person.
Yeah.
I despise the mainstream media. I think a lot of people in mainstream media are horrible time servers going through the motions. There are lots of people in mainstream media I can't say anything good about.
Sure.
But my reaction to somebody I know and respect getting a mainstream media credit in Slate is still, great job getting published in Slate. And that just shows how, the culture is what it is. You have to break through to some degree if you want your stuff to be seen by people outside of various internet bubbles.
It's
Absolutely.
like that's my journey this year. Like I was just doing it on my blogs, on my websites, independently on Twitter for so long, and it was so demoralizing. And the treatment by local corporate reporters has always been so horrible, vicious. I've even on my own website, I broke a couple of really big local stories, and the treatment I got was just horrible. Like I was putting my own time and money. I didn't get paid for it. I was informing the public about a politician who was sexually harassing people, and they went after me so hard.
Ugh.
And so now I've come to realize, like, the only way to tell these stories, which I think are important, like my view on Marilyn Mosby, like I think it's important for everyone to understand all the nuance, is that I have to aim bigger, and I have to pitch, and I have to try to get it. Like, and the funny thing is, I'll tell you what happened this weekend. I got this Slate credit or whatever, and this local former Baltimore Sun, I was with the Baltimore Banner reporter. Like I had reached out to him with a question about something because I'm working on another project, and he took an opportunity to just come after me so hard for the Slate piece and like call me names, because he actually defends that prosecutor Leo Wise, and he was very defensive of him. And it's like, it's like that, and I would love one day to sort of expose everything that he has said to me privately, to try to get under my skin, to try to make me feel terrible, to try to shut me up so that he could keep protecting these powerful people, because I've criticized his work for years publicly. And but when I used to do that, I just got harmed by it. And so it's really tough. But, publishing a book and all of that and getting regular credits is, sadly the only way forward. And if I had, the money and stuff to build my own media empire, I certainly would.
Isn't it weird how it's never those of us who actually would do something genuinely independent who never have the money to do anything genuinely independent?
I don't think it's ironic at all. I think that's how capitalism functions and how it maintains its safety.
I will say that I've had more success on a national level telling Baltimore stories than I could in Baltimore media because of how incestuous and complicit and gatekeeping it is.
I think that makes sense, though, in the same way that it makes sense that someone who wants to be seen a certain way for a specific reason goes after the national headlines instead of the local headlines.
Right.
Because the local media is what tells us what's really going on, but the national media is what tells us how to see the world and how to think.
I'm actually saying something different, though. No, I understand you, but I'm saying something different. That's true for the politicians.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is I had evidence of what really happened to Freddie Gray, the biggest story in Baltimore history, and I couldn't get a Baltimore outlet.
Oh, of course. But that's because that local media, even though, like I say, well, this tells us, this is what's supposedly giving us the facts. It's still, well, okay, but who controls the local media? And now it's all these billionaires who also control national media in various ways. It's just different names and different corporations, but the same.
I see. Bess, what were you going to say? I was just curious.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I was actually going to say that in a different way. That, it's large national, companies have bought out small news, right? And there is almost no independent small news left. Even places, publications that have been in print for years have been bought out at this point, and it is left to the independent media, left to people who are using their own time and money and grit to report the actual truth. And those people sometimes get lifted up by the national media because the story's just too good to resist, right?
Yes.
And that's how it used to be with the local news. But now instead of going to local news, you have to go to national media because they're the only people lifting people up, whether you are an independent journalist or you are a local newspaper. You're all competing on the same playing field.
I wish I had talked to you 2 years ago so that I could skip like hitting my head against the local wall. I wish I had because once I realized I'm going to have to pitch these same stories nationally, I'm going to have to try to make them nationally relevant, it got better. But there's plenty of local outlets in Baltimore, but they just were afraid of,
Well, I mean,
absolutely. Well, and here's one more point I'd like to make, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The reason that you get more traction on a national level is not only because it's not as incestuous, but it's also because the story itself is a good story, right? And so once you sort of can transcend that block and get the news out there, then the story catches fire by itself. And there are other ways to sort of do that. I'm experimenting myself with that with social media, working for Christina Amira Khalil, who is running for the Green Party as senator and in New Jersey. And she, has a similar issue. We can't get on News 12. We can't, get local media to cover her at all. But what we can do is we can get on TikTok. What we can do is we can get enough a national following of her and what's been going on with her life. And that forces the local news to pick up on her, right? Like that's really the game that we're trying to play right now. And, it's in progress. So like, don't come at me and be like, who's that? I haven't heard of her. You're full of shit. Stop it. Go look her up. You have heard of her now. Okay. So, the mediascape has changed and it's hard for independents. It's hard. But if we are smart, I think we can outsmart the big guys.
And it's deceptive because there's a lot of independent media out there that is really just corporate media branded as independent.
Mm-hmm.
Even outlets that I would generally say more good things about than bad. Best example I can think of. The Intercept has done a lot of good coverage of a lot of good topics and broken a lot of good stories. But a serious journalist like Ken Klippenstein just recently quit The Intercept, citing the same kinds of complaints that less serious people like Glenn Greenwald have cited in the past. Now, Glenn Greenwald is a piece of shit on multiple levels, and I understand why people might not like everything he wants to be published and why he might feel censored. But Ken Klippenstein, whatever you think of his politics, is a consistently good journalist who writes about important stuff, and there's a big difference between him complaining about being censored for the content of his journalism and Glenn Greenwald being told, I'm sorry, man, we can't publish all this stuff about you bitching about Hunter Biden anymore.
No, I really didn't know that happened to Ken. He's one of the few like journo bros, journalism bros.
Yeah.
That isn't just the worst at times. The Intercept bros are.
I know his
bag.
It's funny. I think everybody knows his FOIA lawyer better than they know him, because right. I don't know Ken at all, but I know Beth to say hello on the internet.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he has a good voice and he's smart and he does make important stuff. What I was saying, Bess, is that the Intercept bros, I call these white guys bros, who do journalism, they're very mixed. You know what I mean? Like half of the time Ryan Grimm will tweet or write something that I'm like, shit, this is important. And then the other half of the time I'm just like incredibly annoyed. Who does this person think he is?
Yeah.
Especially like just the ableism and some of the misogyny.
knowing that you didn't know it, I will now do something terrible and give free publicity to someone bigger than me, which I usually prefer not to do. But you really should search Ken Klippenstein's Substack and read his Why I Quit the Intercept piece that starts it off.
Yeah.
Because number one, remembering that Ryan Grimm is an editor, his complaining about his experience with editors explains some of the influences under which Ryan Grimm must be operating. And one of his complaints was that the news editor that they hired specifically at his request in order to keep owner representatives off his back while he was trying to actually write stories was himself laid off in the last round of Intercept layoffs. So you've got two sets of things that independent media is supposed to be protecting us from happening here. First, you have media layoffs. I mean, the whole point of these independent media outlets is so that the people who the corporate media was laying off would have some place to work, at least in theory.
Yeah.
And then second, you have laying off the editor whose job it is to protect the journalist because you're pissed at the journalist's work.
Right.
Which is the ownership messing, or even more than the ownership, the legal department messing with the content of the editorial department because they're worried about, because they don't want to make the owner look bad, but using the language of liability. So basically they're saying, we don't want Pierre to look bad to the other billionaires, so could you please tone this down? We're worried about someone suing us, but not really.
Mm-hmm.
You know, speaking of billionaires, like a month ago or a couple months ago, I published something for Fair that was looking at the how the guy who owns Sinclair, you know, the right-wing TV station, bought the Baltimore Sun. And so in investigating that story, I was looking at billionaire purchases of media. And it was really interesting how they would be covered, because they would be covered as saviors of journalism.
Yes.
In so many cases, the Baltimore Banner was purchased by a hotel magnate, or you know, created by a hotel magnate. He was going to save Baltimore. There's a story about the LA Times. This Asian guy, he's a billionaire. I can't think of his name. The story about that purchase starts with champagne being popped, and they're saying he's going to save the LA Times from Trump. This guy was part of Trump. Like, he was their financier, their VP guy.
Yes.
And so it's, you know, my perspective is then when it's a right-wing billionaire who buys out the media, the stories are catastrophic. It's the end of journalism. And it's like, can you guys step back and not make it a political binary thing and actually realize that billionaires buying media is a problem regardless?
Yes. And it's, traditionally, I'm going to put on my stupid history hat now. Traditionally, local media was owned by a local gentry class of millionaires who believed in losing a certain amount of money in order to look good to the peasants and take a stand against the worst corporations and bigger millionaires. And this is sort of the model for liberal journalism. It's where you get the Wall Street Post that publishes the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate stories. But at the same time, these people were still millionaires. Yes, they were writing this off on their taxes and not expecting to make money, but they were still millionaires who were ultimately interested in maintaining a certain status quo through liberal reform. And so they were still going to criticize Martin Luther King if he started supporting housing activists in Chicago.
So, yes, and you know, going back to these positive stories about billionaires buying media, a lot of the stories will be framed as he's doing this out of the goodness of his heart. And he's going to lose money. Jeff Bezos is going to lose money on this, and he realizes that, but he just really wants to save democracy.
Yes.
I don't understand the authors of these pieces not stepping back and saying, well, wait a second, don't you kind of make money when you control public discourse?
Yeah.
Well, it's like they're not.
Yeah, like, I see what Chris said and what you said as a natural progression, actually. Yeah.
Well, there's this. The first round of billionaires owning media was when these local gentry millionaires couldn't afford media anymore because it was getting too expensive.
Right.
And so you see all these news. So you see the local millionaire owning the paper replaced by the corporate newspaper syndicate.
Mm.
That was the first step instead of the paper being owned by the millionaire up the hill where the rich people in town live, now the newspaper is owned by, why can't I remember their name? Everybody knows McClatchy. That's the thing. Now the newspaper is owned by McClatchy instead of being owned by the millionaire up the hill.
Yeah.
And that was the first progression.
Yeah.
And then the second progression was that McClatchy starts selling its papers to richer people because it can't keep them all running. And then you have people saving, you have these weird billionaires saving these weird newspapers in weird markets and it looks really odd. But then you see it progressing to the big papers, and then you start to think, okay, so now when McClatchy fails, who's actually going to save the San Jose Mercury and the Sacramento Bee? Because that's not a market anyone even pays attention to anymore.
Yeah. And is it worth saving?
Well, if you look at the consequences of this progression,
it's still bought out over generations and generations. You know what I'm saying?
If you read Marvel comics, if you read Marvel comics or Superman, you get this old-fashioned journalism setting where the reporters work for the newspaper, and there's a guy who actually writes the crime beat on a regular basis for the city of New York, and who actually works in New York and receives a paycheck from the paper. But in actual fact, now all the local content is outsourced from AP, which is ironic because AP is a national outfit.
Right.
And so you have really, really scary situations where the local Portland paper runs a supposedly local story about protests in Portland that is sourced by a national outfit, the AP, whose local Portland guy only talked to City Hall and the cops and not any protesters.
Mm-hmm.
And then did it secondary sourced everything with the national AP guy who talked to the Department of Homeland Security and the Justice Department.
What do you want us to say, boss?
And this is their local reporting of protests in Portland that ultimately gets carried in the Portland local newspaper and doesn't have any local reporter talking to any local protester.
Yeah, why do you think kids are going on TikTok? Because we're sick of it. We don't want to see that shit. We want to see what's really happening. And we can see what's really happening because our friends are filming it. I don't need your newspapers.
But that's part of the problem with the local media, to sort of circle back to that, is the local media is outsourced to a national stringer.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the point too you made, Justine, about how they always sort of picture these billionaires as saviors, and they're saving these newspapers for the freedom of information, for the American dream, man. Like the reality is that we constantly paint rich people as good, as job creators, instead of wage stealers, which is really what they are.
Yes.
And that's the problem, is that I don't need you coming in here and creating like slave wage jobs. That's not going to make me praise you. I need you to come in here and pay me what the fuck I'm worth.
It also contradicts the actual principles of economics, which says that a job is created because there's a demand that then creates the need for a supply.
That is absolutely true, man. Yes.
But then you start to realize that, well, the actual principles of economics as we know them were made up by a guy who was trying to justify getting the king to allow the middle class to buy stock in the British East India Company, and had already reached the conclusions that he was pretending to reach in his publication of The Wealth of Nations.
It's, you always start with a thesis and then you have to prove it.
But the problem with that is, so political economy is why people don't believe social sciences are hard sciences, which isn't true. Social sciences are hard sciences. The problem is that political economy is completely divorced from all hard social sciences, believes a set of religious parables instead of historical and anthropological facts, and then generates these laws based on the conclusions that they've already reached to justify an existing system.
It's like, I'm going to jump somewhere, but it's because I'm working on this thing.
Of course.
And I know you're cool with this.
Of course.
So I'm working on a project about a case.
Yes.
And so it's real investigative. And, you know, at every level of parties that were involved in investigating this case, they had a couple of premises about what happened. And watching them fit all the evidence into those premises is fascinating, because it's not, I mean, even Freddie Gray is a great example. You know, there were two sides of the case, the prosecution and the defense, and both of them agreed, well, he must have died when the van was moving, because we saw him still moving on this one video of his arrest. But there were other stops, you know, where things happened. Yep. And so it is just interesting how the power of these, it's related to what you're saying. It's like, it's sort of the power of narrative. And if powerful groups want to enshrine that narrative, sometimes what they do is they create a binary where you have two choices, but the two choices are really limiting the reality, you know?
Yeah. There's also
That does not at all describe our current political system at all.
It also has to do with a certain kind of what I'm going to call conspiracy studies, with the problem of which is not that the topic, conspiracies, but rather the methodology. The classic example of which is Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, which purports to prove that the accomplishments of many ancient civilizations were not human accomplishments, but were helped along by benevolent aliens. Now we laugh, but at the same time, this premise of von Daniken's is the basis of all sorts of comic book storylines and movie storylines and TV show storylines, and very serious cultural works by people who purport to be very serious people. It also leads to the corresponding biblical conspiracy studies, like, well, the pyramids were granaries. Who said that? Oh well, never mind. But it's not, the problem isn't that conspiracies aren't something people should explore, but rather than saying, I have a hypothesis, aliens built the pyramids, let me try to prove this wrong by actually testing it against the evidence, which is the scientific method, by the way. An actual scientist is not trying to prove himself correct. He's trying to prove himself wrong, because if anything happens other than what he thinks will happen, he's actually learned more than if what he thinks will happen happens the way he thinks it does. Right. Which leads to the joke that when the Large Hadron Collider was being fired up for the first time, that you have all these physicists sitting around saying, we're going to find out if Higgs was right. We're going to find out if Higgs was right. I really hope he's not wrong. If he's wrong, it's all back to the drawing board. And one of the physicists say, but wouldn't it be so much more fun if he's wrong?
Love that.
And so the whole idea is that at least in theory, every time you're doing a scientific experiment, you could be proving everything you know about science to be wrong and starting over from the beginning. This spirit of inquiry is lacking in conspiracy studies. The conspiracy studies playbook is to start from your premise and then cherry pick only the evidence that supports your premise.
Mm-hmm. It's much more political reasoning.
That's what I was going to say, Bess. Like, you're saying conspiracy, and I'm thinking that's journalism, that's politics, that's just that's just how people operate. Yeah.
But it's like, but it's the conspiracy studies. You hear it in the media. You hear it in the media. People say, well, that's just a conspiracy theory. No, that's part of the problem. Conspiracy studies isn't interested in generating theories. Conspiracy studies currently is just constantly regurgitating new hypotheses and arguing about them and not actually trying to turn them into theories by testing them in any meaningful way.
Well, you have to look at who's making these theories and who the audience for these things are. And I'm sorry, but they're primarily white men, and they're primarily prosperous ones. And
able-bodied ones, I will note.
And able-bodied, thank you. Able-bodied ones, absolutely. And, you know, they want, there is a section of an audience that's sort of captured by Trump right now. And then, you know, all of the little spin-offs of him, right? It's just really, you know, the idea of acknowledging that there are other people than themselves is enough of a punishment to them that they feel like they're being attacked, that they're you know, they have to figure out the conspiracy as to where all of this other stuff came from. Because in the 50s, it wasn't like this. In the 50s, I had dinner on my fucking table, right?
And then these same people that can then generate these weird contradictions, whereas I'm going to name drop the worst person on the internet, where Jackson Hinkle, who's a genuinely horrible person and a genuine anti-Semite,
yes,
can on the one hand claim to support Palestine, and on the other hand, write tweets and record videos defending the pro-Israel protesters throwing racist taunts at black women protesting for Palestine because he defends the white person's right to be racist against the pro-Palestine protester, even though he supports Palestine.
What the fuck is that? Dude.
Exactly. But this is someone who people outside of the United States who don't understand the vagaries of the weird American internet have actually been retweeting, thinking, oh, this is a person standing up for Palestine.
Yeah, well, that was a conversation that was had on the left too, right? When it started happening in October, we were saying, who should we retweet, right? I mean, and I even retweeted Hinkle for a while until I got the full, you know, background.
He's just trying to, I mean, when the right-wingers who are tweeting in support of Palestine are doing so in the hopes that you will get into the habit of retweeting them.
Yeah, absolutely. They're opportunistic and capitalizing.
Another one who's doing the same thing. Andrew Tate and Jake Shields were doing the same thing, and it's shameless. And if you actually look at what they're saying about things, there is every bit as bad as the Zionists and the genuine Islamophobes. And of course, they're Islamophobes too, as well as anti-Semites.
You know, from my perspective, Jewish, the whole discourse is a nightmare.
Yes.
And I wouldn't say that there isn't quite a lot of anti-Semitism on the left in support of Palestine.
Yes.
Also, people don't want to hear that because they think that you mean anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I don't mean that.
Yeah.
I mean leftists who say things who have now been given permission and aren't educated enough to realize that they can't lump Jews in with Israel. And so I saw the other day, there was this horrible New York Post article that was like trying to psychologize something. And it had these 3 sources that were all pro-Israel. But the sources all had, they were like psychologists. It was a totally inappropriate, bizarre story.
Yeah.
But the 3 sources had Jewish names. And
Yeah.
so a popular tweet was going around like, oh, look at the sources, Goldberg, as if having a Jewish name by itself disqualifies you from having a.
I mean, which.
And I mean, sorry. And I also saw there was one that everybody thought was so hilarious, a leftist tweet that was like making fun of saying how the settlers, comparing settlers in Israel, and I'm pro-Palestinian myself, just to be clear, but the settlers in Israel, it was like the Jews hiding in people's attics, always trying to steal space. You know what I mean? Like,
which is a really gross comparison.
But I'm seeing that kind of stuff enough, and I'm more sensitive to it. I'm more sensitive to it.
Yeah.
I'm actually Jewish.
Yeah.
And so there's subtle forms of it too. These like associations with money and stuff, and it's like. So I don't really like any of the discourse.
Yeah.
I wish that like non-Jews and non-Muslims would just shut the fuck up. Like, to be honest with you, and sometimes, I mean, I'm not saying, on the other hand, no, throw your support behind Palestine, but like with the fucking takes, you know what I mean? With like the smart takes on what this all means.
Yeah.
It's like people are not educated.
Well, it's like there's a guy
right about that.
There's a guy in Canada who should know better. And this is the thing that's frustrating. He should know better than this. He used to be a contributing editor to Maclean's. He's not an idiot. He should know better than this. But there's a guy in Canada who's trying to actually say, well, yes, Jews actually should apologize for Zionism because even though most Zionists are Christian, most Jews are Zionists.
I see that kind of shit. I see them apologize for your people. I get those responses almost every.
So listen, let me pop in here for a second. I have been, sort of, with you, Chris, on the forefront of the Twitter arguing.
Yeah.
Especially early on, like in October, November, like right when it happened. And I was angry too. Okay. I'm Jewish.
You are.
I am. Yes. And I was raised Jewish. I went to Hebrew school, like the whole 9. But I noticed that immediately there were some people coming out of the woodworks that are definitely like white supremacist Nazis that were starting to see the conversation. They're starting to see the conversation with Nazi talking points, with Nazi jokes, with the shit that goes around on 4chan. And that has actually seeped into the culture. And when we talk about Hinkle, right? We're talking about actually that. We are talking about how there are people in this conversation that are here not to suggest that, Jews have a right to a homeland, but that Jews should go to a ghettoed homeland so that they can eventually be fucking exterminated. Yes. There are people that are pro-Palestinian that believe this, and Hinkle is one of those people. So I want to just alert everyone to be on the lookout for these talking points, because not everybody saying these talking points actually believes that. Absolutely not. I'm not here to say that, but I am here to say that there have been Nazis that have infiltrated this movement from the second this news blew up. Second that this news blew up, and people are starting to echo talking points without knowing it.
Yeah, so. and wouldn't you say, Bess, though, also, I mean, I agree with you, and this is what I'm talking about, it's like, and if you mention if you point out any of the subtle anti-Semitism along with the anti-Muslim statements, you can get, like, they'll double down with, like, oh, Jewish tears, we're not here for Jewish tears now, you know what I mean, that kind of shit.
Right.
But what I would say to what you're saying is that I think that Nazi sentiments are the mainstream culture in some ways. I think, as a Jew, you must have experienced how much hate, just like sort of intrinsic, even though they like us personally, there's sort of this intrinsic, well, they don't all like me, but I'm sure everyone likes you best, but there is this intrinsic hatred of Jews that even a lot of Jews have, that I grew up with my own, what do you call it?
I mean,
Right. The self-deprecating, like Alan kind of thing. Absolutely.
And shame, and like embarrassment, not wanting people to know that I'm Jewish. Because I just want to finish. Just like benefiting from having a last name that doesn't seem Jewish, all this kind of shit. So
absolutely.
So that like the Nazi stuff is in the mainstream culture. So then when these sort of these people who grow up not really knowing anything suddenly plug into leftism and Palestinianism, they find expression for that. You know?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not saying it's a largely, I'm saying that it's like ableism. It's like, it's everywhere. It's everything.
Right.
So anti-Semitism is also everywhere and everything. And I don't think that the Palestinian movement, by and large, the protests are by and large doing their best to weed that out. The good faith ones.
Right.
But certainly it's in the discourse and the leftist movement right now is allowing a lot of space for it. That's already there. Sorry, I just wanted to.
No, I think it's important. I think it's important to say that because I see people who are otherwise fairly smart and fairly don't normally say Nazi things, say stupid stuff like, well, Israel controls America. And it's like, no, Israel doesn't control America. American capital actually controls Israel in a whole bunch of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And the groups that handle the settlements for Israel are not based in Israel. They're based in New York and Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the business comes from Jews over here.
Well, not even, but let me go ahead and you're Jewish and you did it, even without even necessarily intending to. The business comes from Jews over here. Well, yes, in the sense, and here I'm going to try to be really careful because I'm going to try to deal with facts and also the way people.
Camera off for one quick second. I got to reposition, but you go ahead. I'm listening.
So there's all these things where we think of Jewish people as a group and we say Jews. And the word Jews, in the context it is often used as a label, is itself an anti-Semitic slur in many cases. Which is to say that the reason Zionism was so important to Nathan Birnbaum before he became Orthodox, and the reason it was so important to Theodore Herzl, who was an atheist all his life, was because they were struggling with the fact that society considered themselves Jewish and they considered themselves atheists and not Jewish. And so society says I'm Jewish whether I want to be Jewish or not. Therefore, there must be something to Jewishness other than a religion. And so this whole sort of label of Jew as something other than a Jewish person is itself becomes this anti-Semitic vision people have to feel they have to break free of.
I understand what you're saying, but it's not Christian society that says you're a Jew. If you
True.
It's Jewish society because Judaism is a religion, but it's not a religion defined by birth. It's a religion defined by birth.
But Birnbaum initially was trying to break away from Jewish society and start a different society that was based in this different fundamental truth about what it meant to be Jewish to him, as opposed to what either Jewish society or Christian society said. I'm trying to think of the right way to express it, and maybe I'm not expressing it very well. And it's interesting because ultimately he embraced what Jewish society said about Jewishness and became Orthodox in the end.
Yeah, I mean, Jewish society says a lot of things about Judaism. So I mean, there's a lot of Judaisms.
Yes, this is also true.
Yeah, well, I think you're both making good points, and I think that you're right in saying, Chris, that Judaism is it is a culture that has been defined by the white Jews in this country. When we're talking about Judaism, we're talking about American Judaism. American Judaism has been largely defined by the white Jewish culture in this country.
It's also worth noting that the concept of
I just want to hear the rest of her thought. I'm
sorry.
I'm eating this up because I don't really talk. I don't get a lot of opportunities to talk.
I'll shut up.
That's okay.
Oh, thank you so much. So so this is my perspective on it, is that I feel like I grew up, again, I'm white Russian Jewish, and I grew up in a community where there was a lot of other white Jews, and the stories that we tell ourselves, right? The stories that we tell ourselves that are even, Zionist, are stories of pain, the stories of the Holocaust, stories of oppression, and even the stories that, here when we faced, animosity from like the 30s to the 50s, and these are all such a part of our identity, it feels like. But that only, that perspective only categorizes how white Jews could not fit into white society, rather than the acknowledging Jews as a diaspora, and that there were Black Jews here too that were experiencing something completely different. And I think that I again, and this is kind of a theory, is something I've said before, we've discussed, Chris, that I kind of feel in some ways that Israel is a bid for Jewish whiteness.
Yes.
That, we are, on some level will have a home base to be accepted into the European community in some ways, because I feel America's part of that.
So anti-Semitism, which is the word that becomes the focus of all the arguments. Anti-Semitism is a very specific concept from rooted in a very specific time and place that has become a reality separate from its roots. But the time and place of anti-Semitism is rooted into very specific European institutions.
Mm-hmm. It has to do more with the Crusades, right? Didn't you tell me?
Well, so this is where it gets complicated.
But before we get into that, let me just add one more thing.
I don't want to get into the history of that too much. I'm trying to avoid it.
We don't have to. But I just want to tie a bow on what I was saying, that when I say, that Jewish business comes from here and is, connected to Israel and stuff like that. What my point is not that Jews own this country. It's not that Israel owns America. It's more so that the story of pain that we hear was written by people who had money. And that they are the people who escaped the oppression. That means they had money to escape it. That means that our ancestors, the ones that built this narrative of us being oppressed and everything, actually had not such, as oppressed lives. Now, I will say, because I hear my grandmother yelling at me from her grave, that, of course there was prejudice. Of course, there were only, ghettos sort of, and, there were certain areas, but there were certain areas where Jews were able to build up their businesses. And then because of Israel's policy to recruit Jews from America to go over there and settle, that's how the business became tied. And that was my point.
No, and you're right. And there's
we escaped the okay. So let me just exemplify. My family escaped the Russian pogroms. Okay.
Yes.
One side, my grandmother was very well off. Actually, they managed to pay their way over. They managed to have a jewelry store when they got here, and they did very, very well. And on the other side of the fence, my grandfather escaped. I think from Poland, a little bit of different area than my grandmother did. And he was an orphan and was poor and worked his way up from nothing. So essentially, all I ever heard from my grandmother, because I never knew my grandfather growing up, he passed away. But my grandmother would always talk about, how, all the hardships she went through, how she had to like hold down a business, and she was the first woman to graduate from her class and stuff like that. And she did. She was awesome in a lot of ways. But at the same time, she never knew what it was like to be hungry. My grandmother never knew what it was like to be hungry. Her husband did, but she didn't. So, I'm not saying that Jews are a monolith at all, all. I am saying that a lot of our narratives are written by the people who were rich enough to survive, and the people who
or who are organized well enough to survive, or who.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is some of what you're saying. It's like history is always written by the victors. Like that is just sort of the path of history of all storytelling,
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting because you were talking sort of about like the whiteness of it. And one of the ways in which I see, because a lot of my discourse is with the left, that's where I see the anti-Semitism more, right now, just because that's where the discourse, I'm not saying it's there more.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the forms it can take is this sort of equation of Israel with whiteness, when the majority, like when there's this, very large, I think, plurality of Arab Jews there.
There is, and they are human shields in a very real sense, but that's a whole nother argument.
Right. It's
because
like
they've experienced oppression from the white Jews that
they do. They absolutely do. They do, but they're also anti-Palestinian.
Well, but
that's fine. That's because you're right. It is a more complicated issue than who's good or bad. And I agree with that.
Well, what I was, and this gets back sort of to where I was coming from. So anti-Semitism, as we discuss it in America, is a very white European topic, which is to say that anti-Semitism develops in a part of the world where the entire relationship between the more prosperous class of Jewish society and the entire interaction between the more prosperous class of Jewish society and the more prosperous class of Christian society was based in the questions about how are Christian society and Jewish society supposed to coexist in this European context, which was universally Christian in conception and theory.
This is also partially during the period when they were arguing over whether it was Catholic.
Yeah, these are the same people who would go on to become anti-Semites are the same people who are having extremely important arguments about the nature of Christ and whether we should kill people for saying that Christ is like God instead of saying Christ is the same as God.
Let me ask you a question, though. So, I mean, because maybe I'm not understanding you. Are you saying like an anti-Semitic framework doesn't apply to what's happening to like the Ethiopian Jews?
So there is a framework that applies to what happened
for being Jewish, and they're expelled for being Jewish.
So now
same in the Arab world.
So a lot of what happens in places where people are expelled for being Jewish. And I'm gonna go to something that James Baldwin said about American Black people. A lot of times, Arabs get accused of being anti-Semitic when they're really being anti-Israel, which is to say that yes, there is a history of Jewish expulsions in the Middle East since the establishment of the Israeli state. There is also a history of, I don't want to say peaceful coexistence, that's a very loaded term. There is a history of long-term interaction in the Arab world between Muslims and Jews that has its own framework separate from the Christian and Jewish framework.
I understand that the creation of the Israeli state was the catalyst for a lot of Jewish expulsion in Arab and African countries. However, it's not the whole story.
It's not the whole story.
And hating a people because of the existence of Israel is still hating a people, and it's probably in a lot of cases a cover story. You know, if you're hating a people and then you're blaming it on a government over there, listen, hatred of Jews is longstanding and worldwide, and it precedes. Yes, there's always been some coexistence between Christians and Jews and Arabs and Jews, but there was always anti-Semitism also. Maybe I'm curious about why you don't call that anti-Semitism or call it anti-Israel when it's really hating the people that are there. A lot of people who hate Israel hate me. I've met them.
So
especially a lot of people in Baltimore and Baltimore's leftist communities and stuff.
I will never say that there are not anti-Semites out there.
Let me finish this thought. They hate me because they hate Israel, but it seems to me like they hate me because I'm Jewish, and so I don't think that hatred of Israel can be used as an excuse worldwide, or even in this country and not that country, for hating Jews. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
I do.
On to that also.
I do with a difference, and I'm trying to express the difference, and I'm going to keep having trouble.
Maybe Jews are the ones who should be leading this because we live with this. Like, I know when people express hatred towards me or distrust of me, from certain groups in Baltimore that I've been in, where Jews left the community because it was like there's too much anti-Semitism, and they're saying it's about Israel and not Jews. I know that what they're saying, because if they're making it about me, I have nothing to do with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm saying. I don't understand why that doesn't apply on this basis.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first, I'm trying to think of the right place to start, and it always feels arbitrary whenever you start in any one place in history, and so I've
heard this a lot. I've heard a lot that it's not actually hatred of Jews in this country or that country. It's just hatred of Israel. But I experience the same thing here, so I don't buy it.
So
yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
So
yeah.
Now I'm going to try to get away. I'm going to get away from the topic of hate entirely and instead talk about processes, I guess. I don't like that either.
Would you mind if I responded to what she said first?
Please go ahead.
Okay, cool. So I think I like your perspective. I think that that there is plenty of anti-Semitism to go around in both the Zionist and anti-Zionist movements. Honestly, because there are Jews that are fighting for Palestine, right? There are plenty of Jews, Jewish Voices for Peace, right? There are plenty of organizations that are fighting for Palestine that are being literally attacked by Zionists, right? So there has been an effort among the leftists that I know to stop saying Jewish and to start saying Zionist. And I think that is extremely important. I think extremely important distinction to me.
I think in some cases people should even say settler instead of Zionist because
I mean, that's really what it is.
Yeah, there are Zionist movements that are not nationalist. Yeah.
And while most Zionist groups are synthetic now, I don't want to assume that everybody has synthesized a political agenda simply because most have. But that's actually the best place to start with my thoughts. Zionism is itself a reaction to European anti-Semitism.
Hey.
And the question is,
Chris,
do we assimilate or leave?
Hey.
Sorry.
That's okay. Can I finish what I was saying first?
I want to hear it.
I'm sorry. So what I was trying to say is that we are in a period where the term anti-Semitism is becoming so confused to the point where the government can start to use it for anybody who disagrees with them. and it's becoming a McCarthyism, right? So, and again, I know you're going to go into the historical context of this, Chris, and I can't wait for it. But I just wanted to make that point really quick because it's important. The term anti-Semitism is being diluted to the point of meaninglessness, and I'm not saying that the concept of anti-Semitism doesn't still exist, because it does, and that is important to know. And there are a lot of people, as I said before, that are using this conflict as an excuse to express their anti-Jewish hatred. That happens. But at the same time, the word anti-Semitic is not accurate, because Palestinians are also Semitic, genetically speaking.
Well,
So
I don't like to get into genetics because that raises a whole other.
I find this, okay, again, because this is not a scientific assertion. This is a political assertion. Because it's important to know that, regardless of religion, we are all from the same area. And it is not, this is so much larger than religion. It is so much larger than that.
If we're going to go to genetics, which I really didn't want to do, but if we're going to go to genetics, genetically speaking, historically, you had Israelites prior to what we would call, to what the Old Testament would call the division between Israel and Judah, and then you had Israelites and the tribe of Judah after the division into two kingdoms, and then you had the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. At which point, this is where it really gets important, because the two groups, Israel and Judah, experienced their colonization by outside groups in different ways, and experienced each other's experience in different ways. So the people writing in Judah about Israel say the Assyrians killed everybody and dragged them all away and replaced them all with completely new people from Assyria, which is historically and anthropologically not really supported.
Wait, you're telling me that all of this is based on a lie?
I'm saying that there are lies involved, and that one of the first lies is that one. Wow. The first lie was that the Assyrians killed or enslaved or deported everyone and settled what had formerly been the lands of the 10 tribes of Israel with completely new people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire. Now, this is a lie that comes up a lot in the history of Israel and Palestine, and it's useful to know that this is a place where we can clearly point to it happening before anything that we consider now when we talk about, well, is it or is it not anti-Semitic?
Okay, so one thing that's come up from the things that both of you said and that I said, and that makes a meeting point, because Chris, you were sort of talking about how anti-Semitism applies in Europe, and I was sort of pushing back.
Yes.
With the hatred of Jews not just being about Israel around the world.
Yes. So
maybe if anti-Semitism, and Bess, you mentioned this word kind of being meaningless, and the history of that term is.
I don't think it is meaningless. I think that it's So let me just clarify that really quickly, if you don't mind. Sure. There's an argument going around the left that is no longer left, I like to call them, that is arguing that ID politics is now meaningless because it's been co-opted by corporate media.
Right.
I completely disagree with that, even though my point about anti-Semitism was similar. I believe that anti-Semitism is a term that's being co-opted by certain groups and our government at this point for political usage.
Right.
However, the concept of anti-Semitism, the fact that there are people in this country that hate Jews, is a reality that has always existed and still will continue to exist. So
got it. I get it. Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. So I think what I'm trying to say is that if we sort of just put the term aside, what we can agree with is anti-Jewishness.
Yes.
Existing worldwide, having similarities around the world, but also differences around the world, having Israel being both a cause but also a scapegoat for it. Like,
and then
I all agree.
And it comes back.
I agree with that.
And it comes back to this and it comes back to this original definition of who is and who isn't Jewish, which is based on the notion, and my source on this is an excellent book by Jewish anthropology professors in New York and Israel called The History of the Jewish Peoples, which is an academic book and thus incredibly expensive whenever you find it anywhere online, but is worth reading if you can find it. I found it at a library and checked it out. But anyway, so the point is, you have the two kingdoms pre-diaspora. And then you have the conflicting events of the diaspora told from different points of view by different segments of its survivors. The first conflict is what actually happened to the other 10 tribes, where the people who claimed themselves to be the descendants of the tribe of Judah deported to Babylon said, they're gone. They were exterminated. They don't exist anymore. Whereas the people who still lived in what was called Samaria by the time the Romans were in charge considered themselves the legitimate descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. And this was the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are about this disagreement and failure to agree on definitions of each other by the people who lived in what had been Judah and Israel and was now Judea and Samaria before the exiles from Babylon returned, and the returning exiles. And the returning exiles wanted to be exclusive and not let the people who had lived in the homeland the whole time into the club, while the people who lived in the homeland the whole time also didn't want to let the returning exiles into the club unless they were given a certain seniority for having never left. And so you have this dispute about identity by people who are trying to define each other in order to protect their own power. And you have a social conflict between these groups. And the whole definition of who isn't or isn't a Jew, by the time Christians start talking about what Jesus says in the New Testament, comes down to this argument between the people who Jesus called Samaritans and the people who Jesus called Jews. Now, if you want to take it further than that, there is a lot of evidence to support the fact that Jews and Palestinians are the same people on a genetic level if they both live in Palestine. Which is to say that there is no fundamental genetic difference between a Palestinian Jew, a Palestinian Christian, or a Palestinian Muslim. They are all just descendants of people in the same region whose ancestors at one point chose a different religion.
I'm not sure, I haven't really studied a lot of this. Like Bess, my upbringing was so different. I was raised secular, we did Christmas and it was like very culturally Jewish, but no religion. We did like a Passover that was kind of light, Passover light.
I was not Orthodox. Oh no, I was not Orthodox. I was very Reformed. I get it.
So we weren't even that, you know what I mean? And I also didn't grow up around Jews.
Okay.
So it's just different. Like it's different, but it's interesting because I think there are things about Jewish identity that I still think about a lot. I still work out and are things that I don't think I've never met a non-Jew who understands. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like it's very complicated. I was raised to not believe there is a God, or to not think that a temple is anything I ever needed to go to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then, like, later I explored that, and I still have an interest in exploring it more. And I've certainly come to understand how, like, Jewish kinds of conceptions of God influenced my parents' ideology anyway, regardless. They grew up very, in more religious households. But so that, the ideology's there regardless, even if the household is secular. I don't really believe there are secular households. Like, we're all surrounded by ideology. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think people who really push how atheist they are sometimes not aware of their guiding ideologies, their sense of power,
Yeah.
As a perfect example, a large number of settlers since the fall of the Soviet Union are Russian people who have rediscovered their Jewish descent, both with and without scare quotes.
But there's so many things about communist Russia that have like
yes.
Jewish ideology in them.
Yeah, so since we're talking about non-Jews talking about anti-Semitism, let's just go with the fact that Winston Churchill said that there was a battle for the Jewish soul between communism and Zionism. And that Jack Kirby, who is the genius who created most of the superheroes of Western Christian culture, but who was culturally Jewish, and who struggled with questions of religion and identity and Zionism all his life, was really basing Magneto and Professor X more on Abraham Stern and Albert Einstein, and this idea of extreme Zionism versus universal humanism and communism as these two poles of this struggle for the Jewish soul. So Churchill and Jack Kirby sort of agree on this notion of communism versus Zionism as this international struggle.
There's a reason under McCarthyism, so many of the people they went after were Jewish.
Exactly.
There's a reason Jews were so attracted to communism. There's a reason my parents' form of secular Judaism or
Trotsky.
Trotsky
was Jewish.
Has this kind of socialist feel. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So it's interesting.
Absolutely, I agree. And let me just say real quick, Chris. My family. So you got to understand, my parents were hippies. Okay, my both of my grandparents were religious, but I had to go to Hebrew school because of them. But my mom didn't give a shit. My mom was a new agey. She believed in God as like a spirit that's within all of us kind of shit. You know what I'm saying? I grew up with that. Like, right. I do not believe in a God, because I do not believe that there is any being in this universe that is superior to another being. I don't believe that. I think everybody is different and equal, no matter what their abilities are. So if there is a being that is even remotely like the biblical God, he's still not my fucking God, because he's not superior to me. That's how I feel.
This is where I break in. This is where I break in to plug a future project that I hope to do if I ever find the right people to come on the show.
Is it called Chris Loves Jews?
No, it's a show called The God of Constantine, which is how the modern notion of God as an omnipotent and omniscient ruler of the universe who controls everything was sort of forced on us by an emperor who wanted us to believe that he was really in control. But that's a whole nother subject.
Yeah. Bess, I feel like it's known how many Jews, and especially in this country, are secular or more like us than not like us.
Yeah.
Right.
But what interests me as I was kind of like learning about Judaism as an adult is that it's kind of hard to express, but like, we are guided by Judaism in ways, like even the conception, like I grew up around so many Christians that I didn't understand that there was a conception of God that wasn't judging. You know what
Superman.
I mean?
Something as simple.
Jewish God is just too busy, or you know what I mean?
Something as simple.
I'm sort of interested in that, even though there's been this sort of apparent betrayal of Judaism by like our generations, or our parents also with the hippies and stuff, that it sort of continues in these other forms. You know what I mean?
I absolutely agree with that.
Christian rebellion, like rebellion to Christian Orthodox. Yeah, sorry.
Yes,
something is
absolutely agree with that. I have a lot to say on that, actually.
something is culturally something is culturally and iconically American to Superman started out as a speculation by a Jewish guy. Well, what would the Messiah actually look like if he were actually real? And it ended up as Superman. And this becomes a bedrock part of American Christian culture.
Yeah, yeah. That's a lot of what Jews do, is that we sort of create Christianity for you guys. We market it.
Yes, no, I know.
Well, so
there's a lot of this in Hollywood where Jewish screenwriters write these deeply Christian movies appealing to the prejudices of WASPs.
Yeah.
Well, because here is a field in which it is not uncommon to go from nothing to something. Okay, this is a field in which you are influencing thought, and that's something that the Jews knew, and that's something that Black people knew. Right. And when they got their hands on some entertainment, because unfortunately, the way that they came up through entertainment was through minstrelsy.
Let's remember that it wasn't even so much when they got their hands on it. And I don't mean this in a conspiratorial way. I mean this in a cultural way. American comic books are deeply, deeply Jewish in ways that you have to either study comic books or be Jewish to understand.
Well, again, I agree with you. And so to express here is that there is a cultural Judaism that is separate from the religion. And I do feel that it is a cultural Judaism specific to white Jews, and that we do sort of in the way that as feminists, we sort of assume that the white feminist experience is the same for all women. The white Jewish experience is the same for all Jews. That's also not true.
Right.
But there is a culture, a strong culture, because of people like Woody Allen, because of people like Mel Brooks, because of people that, his name is escaping me, the comedian Jackie Mason, because of people like this, there is a culture, right? There is, you know what the word schmear means. There is a sense of humor that can be sort of classified as Jewish, even though it's often used by anti-Semites in that way. But there is also, like, if you look at like Neil Simon plays, if you look at like Stephen Sondheim, okay, is a great example of this, because he has this beautiful way that I feel is specifically Jewish. He has this beautiful way of making these profound emotional statements with humor that I really honestly believe that you have to be Jewish or have a deep understanding of Jewish culture to be able to portray correctly. And
sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you, do you think culture and religion can be divided that easily?
No.
Right.
I don't think I'm
like
I am of the mind, right? Like if you can mentally connect these two ideas. My mother grew up, I grew up with my mother telling me that the universe is all one energy and we are all one energy, right? So in some ways, the things that I like to think about are how, to classify certain things and separate certain things in my mind. But they're still part of a cohesive whole, right?
That the universe is all one energy is a distinct summation of the philosophical work of a Jewish man.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, your mother.
The Kabbalah.
Well, I have to. It's depressing when I forget.
I'm so sorry, you guys. I have to get going. I'm really sorry.
We could go on forever,
I know there's never a good exit point, but I also get really interested in things, especially when you started bringing up Neil Simon.
I love Neil Simon. Love.
Bess, what is your? I'm just curious. Like, what is your podcast like? I mean,
my podcast is a lot like this, except it's me hosting. That's all.
Thank
It's
you.
nothing. I am a catchy name and not too much of a structure right now, to be honest. So I just interview people and we kind of just shoot the breeze and talk about whatever they feel like talking about. And you're totally welcome to join me. I would love to have you on.
She has been talking to a lot of Green Party people in New Jersey recently
have,
for
yeah.
obvious
Working with the
reasons
Green
because
Party.
it's
My
a third
usual,
party.
my usual topic, and Chris has generously hosted me, and I hope I didn't cut you off too much. I was very inspired because I don't get chances to have conversations like I've had here with Bess ever. So it was really like a lot for me in a good way.
I cut off everybody else. Cutting me off too is fine. I need people to say that sometimes.
I like to talk about disability mostly, and the intersection with politics is a good one if you ever want to have that conversation.
I would love to have that conversation. My best friend has CP, and we talk about disability all the time.
Right.
Come on my show, please. That would be great.
That would be great.
No, and the next time I talk about how the media covers things, I want to have Justine on, because both the disability thing and the cop thing are examples of how selectively the media covers stuff and how the media privileges sources and stories over other sources and stories.
Yeah.
And I ended up, and not to in any way disparage the wonderful Julia Doubleday, who is a great writer, who is doing important COVID journalism and who I love and who everyone should subscribe to. But I really wanted to have Justine on for that show because she does both. She occupies that intersection of crime journalism and disability activism where you see how the media distorts everything.
I started a Substack. I'm slow. I'm like once a month posting because I have other projects. But it's called Criminalizing Disability.
Yes.
Really at the root of that intersection, which is really what criminal justice really is. If you really drill it down, it's about the kind of physical other.
Yeah.
And the ways in which all of these, like criminalizing masks, the institutionalizing, the expansion of conservatorships, this kind of broad criminalizing of disability, and creation of disability through homelessness and then criminalizing it, etc.
Malthusianism.
I will definitely check that out. Thank you. That sounds awesome.
I gotta do more, but I'm slow on it. I knew the idea was good and I started it, and I don't have what Julia has. Julia is just a machine of producing every on-point COVID-related story. She's so good, And then she does it, and I'm like, oh, I don't have to, But she's the only one doing it, and she should be in Time magazine. You know what I mean? But they don't.
Now there are a couple of other people writing good stuff too. I want to give a call out to the OK Doomer Substack, which is really good, really topical, really funny in a very dark way. And so there's good stuff out there, but yeah, Julia is really doing the journalism on the topic very, very well, and I want to get her back on too.
So I'm gonna just because
take care.
It was so good to meet you, Bess. Thank you.
So great to meet you.
Conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Same.
I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Can we give her a shout out in her book and her?
Her book is They Killed Freddie Gray by Justine Barron, The Anatomy of a Police Cover-Up. People should read it. People should check out Justine's Substack. But people should read the book. People should buy the book. People should support the book. She literally wrote the book on the cover-up of the Freddie Gray murder.
Literally.
And so, I mean, you have to understand that when people are reporting on the Freddie Gray story, they're talking about her work, whether they're referencing her or crediting her or not. In the same way that when big media runs clips that Status Quo took of January 6th or East Palestine without crediting them, they're also exploiting these independent creators who are doing the real work. And who aren't even being referenced in the AP credits.
You're absolutely right. It's sickening.
And I did want to get that out there about Justine and Julia, who both deserve our support and who are in many ways shut out and blacklisted because they're independent journalists and aren't part of the system. Like she was saying about how people were attacking her in local Baltimore media when she was just trying to get published locally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. Both strong, intelligent women. Amazing. I love that you're not. Can I just take a second to praise you, Chris? I love that you're not intimidated by strong, intelligent women, and that you welcome us and you welcome our opinions and you like to hear what we have to say. Like it's so refreshing. You have no idea.
Well, I want to hear what everybody has to say. I'm just worried that I'm just glad when people tell me when I'm interrupting too much.
Well, I'm glad that you're receptive to it. I really appreciate it. And I do that too. I mean, it's just, we get passionate about things. What do you
Well, no, I immediately have a thought. Somebody says something and my brain connects a thought to it. And then I want to get that thought out. And if I don't get it out fast enough, I won't remember it. That's the worst part. Yeah, exactly. I can blame that. And maybe that's unprofessional of me. I don't know.
You know what?
But no,
this world was built by people who were drunk 24/7. I don't want to fucking hear it.
That's and hey, let's remember too that the glory days of NBC News that everybody talks so highly about, they were all drunk 24/7 in those
100, bro.
The hard drinking NBC newsman.
Mm-hmm. Right? It's like Anchorman, right? You remember that movie Anchorman with Will Ferrell?
Yes, I do.
Oh my God, I fucking love that movie. Anyway.
Or back, or even back on, you can go all the way back to Network and see that stuff.
Yeah, totally.
Or what was the other one between Network and Broadcast News? See, there you got three generations of media lampooning: Network, Broadcast News, Anchorman.
Yeah, and I guess it's such an institution.
It's just people have been talking about the media for a long time. The candidate with Robert Redford isn't so much about the election as it is about the media and the media looking at the election and how the media handles the election and how the candidate himself has come to have his campaign defined by the media to the point where at the end he's like, well, we won. Well, what do we do now?
Yeah. I mean, that goes to the point that I was making before, is that the media is a very powerful area. It's an area of influence. It's an area of money. And it's an area where you can take a big swing and have it work out for you. I mean, it's a gamble. It's absolutely a gamble, but it is, it's something where, mob think comes into play, where, people's baser instincts, where emotions come into play. And that, can
there's a window
up a system.
There's a window during the discussion of any news story where journalists tell the truth. And then that window is slowly closed by censorship and the changing of public opinion and the needing to adapt to political realities and pander to what is perceived as public opinion, which in often cases has been created and exaggerated by the media that is pandering to it.
Yep, absolutely.
And it makes real independence extremely difficult. The Intercept is now acting like all the traditional media, because in the end, its money comes from a billionaire who wants to see some sort of return on his capital without getting sucked into too much liability.
Mm-hmm. And there's also something to be said for, I mean, if you can picture the mainstream narrative as an actual stream, right? Mm-hmm. And that there are some of us who are trying to oppose it, swimming upstream. I mean, it's literally that, to the point where your audience is floating down the stream and you have to catch them sort of before they go down the waterfall. You know what I'm saying? We're fighting a narrative.
Now,
and sometimes we're not loud enough.
this makes me think of a specific image by a specific philosopher in a specific time and place.
Do
And
tell.
then, of course, he was also Jewish, but that's a whole nother discussion. But a Frenchman named Henri
Jewish
Bergson.
I'm telling you. Okay.
Henri Bergson.
Oh,
Uh,
sorry about that.
theorized reality as a stream of phenomenon that were happening all at the same time, but were then sorted out in order by our minds in the way our minds experience the consequences of those phenomena.
I'm familiar with this concept.
So this is what I think when you now, whether or not you agree with that image of reality,
I kind of do.
that is definitely an excellent metaphor for the way that the media creates its own reality based on what's happening at any given moment and how that fits into everything else.
That's right. I mean, that's kind of how, I completely agree. That's kind of how I find joy in thinking about politics and thinking about these concepts, because there, the world is not linear or binary. We just want it to be because it's easier to think about.
Well,
And the idea that we are in a reality in which is as much arbitrary as it is planned, and that contradictions are real.
our existence is linear, and so we experience reality in a linear way. That doesn't mean we know what the reality that we experience is in a clear way beyond our experience of it.
Well, exactly.
That's where it gets complicated.
We are beginning to realize that a linear experience of time and life and space is actually one perspective too many. And I think that's what it is. And that is also something that it's a kind of mindset that I like to apply to politics, because the way that we structure arguments, we so routinely just accept that they're linear, right? Even the mainstream media arguments were just like, oh yeah, of course, this, that, and this, that. And it's actually, it's that narrative is as much crafted and shaped as the way we see our reality, because we are sort of like when we're talking about particle physics, right? Quantum science, like the observation affects the action of what you're looking at. And you're sort of materializing your reality around you. So it's possible that we are materializing a linear reality around us because we are only capable of experiencing such.
Now this is yes and no. I always get careful about notions of materializing reality, and that's because
I'm not.
I am the enemy.
Go ahead.
I am the enemy of positivity as a cult. Because positivity as a cult all too often the cult of positivity is all too often co-opted in the service of capitalism, and we need to have a certain understanding of the negative consequences of things in order to be able to build on the past. At the same time, we do need a certain amount of positive thinking in order to not get bogged down in our own negativity, which can become self-fulfilling.
Well, it's similar to the argument we were saying about ID politics, right? Where just because it's been co-opted by capitalism doesn't mean that it didn't come from a real place. It didn't come from real study.
But it's not just in this case that it's co-opted. It's this case on the idea that the positive thinking cult is a religious idea from Christianity that has taken on a life of its own outside of Christianity.
Yeah, I believe that.
the positive thinking is the idea that if you are a quote unquote good Christian and a good person and properly fitting into your place in God's plan, then good things will just happen to you because you're predestined to be saved. Of course,
Well, yeah,
now
I definitely
ultimately the big sticking point of all this is that salvation is assumed to be a predestination rather than something that someone is capable of achieving, which then leads to a problem. And this is this is why I'm a heretic and not orthodox in any way.
Same.
But one of the early dispute in Christianity as well are people if people can choose to be good and be saved because they can choose to be good, then why did Christ need to die? Versus, well, if people can't if people can't choose to be good, then what was the point of Christ dying? And you have this sort of idea where if both arguments of this notion of Christian salvation, predestination or free will, are require you to accept certain ideas about sin and God. And this is where you get to the notion of what your mom was telling you versus, what someone would say in any Orthodox faith, which is, is God, what is God, who is God, what is the nature of God? The answer that a lot of people have reached, which is called pantheism, is that, and this expression is from a Jewish writer whose name I can't remember right now, but pantheism is basically easily described as the universe trying to learn from its own mistakes.
So, like, there'd be shitty gods and then better gods eventually?
No, it's like, so if you think of creation and God and the universe as all the same thing, so you think of the Big Bang as a point in a cycle here on a circle.
Mm-hmm.
And you think of the point of absolute singularity where the universe contracts on itself and ends as another point on a circle.
Mm-hmm.
Then here you have the Big Bang. And the Big Bang, before the Big Bang, is what you're talking about when you say in the beginning, either in the book of Genesis or the book of John, whether you want to get Jewish or Christian about it.
Mm-hmm.
It starts within the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the beginning? Well, the beginning is a point on a circle.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at the text, both in the Christian John and the original translated from the Hebrew into the modern English Genesis in the Tanakh, what you have is in the beginning, there was all this other stuff that clearly suggests there was something before the beginning.
Yep.
If it's the beginning, what is God doing there? Who is God? How did he get to be there? Why are we calling this the beginning without answering these questions of God?
I love. Hey, have
so
you?
So the answer to this is
God
is the singularity.
Before you even get there, let me paint that picture for a second.
Sure.
Have you read the Narnia books?
I have.
So you know that in the last one, they talk about the beginning of the world of Narnia, and it seems to be that is exactly how
the next to last one is the Narnia creation myth, the Narnia version of Adam and Eve, and then the last one is the Narnia book of Revelation, where everybody dies and goes to heaven.
Well, but when they describe how Narnia is created, whatever book I can't remember. They describe it as the world is already underneath their feet, but they can't see.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then things start coming into being as Aslan calls them into being, right?
Things start becoming yes, things
Yeah,
start
so I just wanted to
assuming shape and
that
form.
picture, which is hilarious because it's really all about perspective. Like, what were you standing on? Where did these other shits come from? Like, what?
Well, it's like, well, to use the same book as an example, there's also an end of the world moment in that story where they go to the, if you've seen the movie The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the bad guy in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie is the bad guy in the next to last book. And the before Narnia is created, the main characters of the next to last book visit her world just before it ends and accidentally bring her with them into their own world, and they get into Narnia trying to get her back to where she came from.
Yep.
So the metaphor is the wood between the worlds, where when you're not in our world anymore, but you haven't gone into another world, you're in this endless forest with all these ponds that all look the same, and you're just looking at all these ponds. And so if you know which pond you're jumping into, you can go to any world you want to go to.
Right.
But if you're just randomly jumping into ponds, you don't know where you're going.
Well, no, that's not actually true. You have to have the ring because
yes, you have to have the ring.
They don't know that they're going
to
Chan, right? That the planet that the queen is from is called Chan or Cha.
And you know, and
they don't know what this planet is, so they're wearing the right rings.
You know, just for a comic book reference, it's a green and a yellow ring.
Green and a yellow ring, right?
Somebody else had read C.S. Lewis when they were creating Green Lantern.
I'm 100% sure. 100%
no, you know it's true because
absolutely,
you know, because the guy who created Green Lantern was also a straight science fiction writer who, you know, read the fantasy and science fiction stuff that other people were writing before him. That's what influenced him.
Absolutely.
So, but it's kind of funny how you can see stuff like, oh, it's the red, it's the yellow and the green ring.
Yeah.
But no, yes, you have to have the green ring to get into the wood, and you have to have the yellow ring to use a pool.
Right, right.
But those mechanics aside, each pool is a world, and if you don't know which pool you're jumping into, you don't know where you're going. You're just getting pot luck.
Yep.
And they, in the attempt of trying to get back to the dying world where they got the witch, they end up in Narnia instead,
right?
And she ends up being the serpent in Aslan's garden,
right? Quite literally.
Literally, it's very metaphorical. Which is also why I call the last book his version of the Book of Revelation, where everybody dies and goes to heaven at the end, because that's actually what happens.
Yeah.
Except the one girl he didn't like because she grew up, and so he decided that because she grew up, she shouldn't get to go to heaven with the rest of them.
What, Susan?
Yes.
Oh, poor Susan. I feel like Susan is very.
Now, in her defense, to be fair, she also didn't die with the rest of them because she wasn't in the train when the train wrecked.
Right.
But that aside, still.
Okay, well, this is a depressing note.
That's how deep C.S. Lewis's big biblical allegory in Narnia goes. The next to last book is Genesis, and the last book is Revelation.
Yeah,
and they are almost completely biblical allegory.
Yes.
The story is much less important than the allegory in both cases, especially in the case of the last book.
Yes, absolutely. The ending is very ambiguous.
But yes, I have read C.S. Lewis. I know exactly what you're talking about.
And I just think I'll sum it up with this. I just think it's interesting that when you were describing to me the things that my mother explained to me and the concept of, like energy and oneness, it actually, for her, the things that she expressed to me were through science and through
Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza. That's his name, Baruch Spinoza.
Okay, and also through through Buddhism and Hinduism.
But Baruch Spinoza was the Sephardic Jewish gentleman from Europe who said that the universe is one energy.
Oh, I mean, I believe you. I'm not disagreeing.
No, I know. I
just
remember
thought it was interesting that the framework in which you described it was almost very Christian. And to me, the way that I would describe it to people is actually a lot more scientifically based.
But it's all the same thing, regardless of the framework you use. And the reason, and this is why the Big Bang and singularity, this was my point. So that moment before everything starts, Jewish or Christian, and we're talking about that nature of, well, what is God? Who is he? How did he get there? So in this framework, God is the singularity. God is everything all in that one compacted form.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Big Bang happens. And all of creation is God spreading out to create the universe and having all these experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Until he reaches, as far as he could possibly go this time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of creation is God coming back to where he started.
That is, and it's interesting that you put it that way to me, because there's scientific evidence to prove that the universe is expanding and contracting. And that's how I would have phrased it instead.
And but that's the whole thing and that's why I'm phrasing it the way I'm phrasing it is this
it's interesting.
This very religious. This is the way that Spinoza in his philosophy defined existence.
Okay.
And so when you have the universe expanding and reaching its limits and then contracting and to go back to where it started, what you have is God learning everything about the universe he's created by spreading himself out to his limits and going back to where he started to apply everything he's learned from the process and then doing it again.
Oh, okay.
And if you see it this way,
so
you
that,
don't
like,
have
each
the
time we reach a little closer to enlightenment.
You may or may not. And who knows? This is a metaphor. This is not, I do not pretend to have the answers. This is my description of the deeper meaning behind the whole the universe's energy and oneness. It's this notion that God is the universe trying to learn from its mistakes, which basically is taking us away from this linear experience. Mm-hmm. Because the linear experience says we have a beginning and we have an ending and we go from the beginning to the ending.
Yeah. Here's something to fuck your
Whereas
brain.
we're on a circle.
Here's something to fuck your brain up.
Yeah.
A circle is still a 2D way to think about reality.
Oh, sure.
Which, because it super isn't, like.
Oh no, I know. All metaphors for reality use fewer dimensions than our actual reality.
Absolutely. How else can we comprehend them?
Even our basic reality is 4-dimensional, which is to say length, width, mass, and time.
And time, yeah.
And we describe our reality primarily in 3-dimensional terms.
Mm-hmm.
And we depict our reality primarily in 2-dimensional terms.
Yeah.
But our reality is 4-dimensional.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not going on. And then you get to onto what Rod, if you meet enough other needs up to that point, then you get to what Rod Serling said, we are entering the 5th dimension, the dimension of imagination.
Imagination. I think the 5th dimension is supposed to be a tesseract, isn't it?
Well, the idea is that imagination is what expands our universe once we've reached the limits of space and time. Because the first 3 dimensions are space, and the 4th dimension is time.
Yeah.
And so since we do not have definitions of the dimensions past 4,
Right.
the 5th dimension has to be imagination by definition.
Well, it has to come from our imagination.
Yes, at the very least. At the very least.
I don't know if it has to be imagination.
Metaphysics.
Yeah, it's an interesting. We could do a whole other podcast on this, Chris. This is.
But that's the whole thing. Is most of those metaphysical questions don't actually mean anything. It's the 4-dimensional questions of the reality we actually live in that matter, and the 2 and 3-dimensional depictions are not enough. But the 5th dimensional navel gazing is too much.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that imagination doesn't have its purpose, but to be useful, imagination needs to serve 4-dimensional purposes.
That's true.
I think that's my final thought for the day. Do you have anything you want to promote?
That's great. I would just tell people to go follow me at Malensplain on every platform ever, and to go check out my podcast. As Chris mentioned, I've been interviewing a lot of Green candidates recently. The last one being Chibu Asonye, who is running for Illinois, and she is actually a firebrand. She was amazing. And we had a really interesting conversation about Jill Stein's arrest and what happened prior to that, and how the cops were just essentially waiting for dusk to descend upon this group of students. So it's a very interesting story. She told it very well. So I recommend go check it out.
I have 2 competing sets of thoughts that are enough for their own show, which is, number 1, yes, they arrested Jill Stein just for being Jill Stein. But then the second point is, but Jill Stein won't tell everybody to just wear a mask, because even Jill Stein is scared to tell people to just wear a mask.
Well, okay, that is like 2 conversations.
I know. That's why I said that's its own. It's worth its own show.
It is maybe, but you know what? Listen, you should, if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you go check out the story, because it made me think very well of Jill.
Well, no,
I thought that she acted very honorably in the situation.
She always does, almost always, I should say. I wasn't a big fan of her speaking at the Rage Against the War Machine, but I think she's learned her lesson.
That was an organizational decision, I think, too.
No, well, so I am somewhat privy to the way that decision was made and how some people were pissed after it, from people on the National Council who are on the losing side of the decision-making process. And basically what it came down to is Jill Stein decided to do something. And then people in the Green Party raised the question of, should Jill Stein do this? To which point the Jill Stein people in the Green Party said, yes, she should, and the Green Party should be behind her. To which point a bunch of other people said, no, she shouldn't, and this is why. Well, I think we lost Bess there. Either she'll come back in a moment or she won't. If she's not coming back, we'll wrap up. But if she does come back, I'll finish my thought before we wrap up. But for everybody else, the thinking was that it was about, well, the Jill Stein people were saying, well, we have to go because it's anti-war, and the Howie Hawkins people were saying you can't go because it's pro-Russia, and we're kind of motivated by being pro-Ukraine. And so there was a whole argument about it that didn't really come down to the real argument, which is about, should the Green Party be at a libertarian event, which is a whole other argument. And here it looks like we have Bess.
Sorry about that.
Welcome
My
back.
iPad died. It was
so what I was saying is basically there was this, Jill Stein people wanted to do it because it was anti-war.
Mm-hmm.
And the Howie Hawkins people didn't want Jill Stein to do it because it was anti-Ukraine. And there was this whole argument about whether the Green Party should do something pro-war or shouldn't do something that was anti-Ukraine. And there was never a proper argument about whether or not the Green Party should be attending a primarily libertarian rally run by the Nazi group that just took over the Libertarian Party.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they weren't willing to drill down on that question enough.
Yeah.
Even in the even the people opposed to Jill Stein speaking there were coming off too much from a pro Howie Hawkins, pro Ukraine sort of thing, and not enough about well, should we be speaking at a libertarian event where there are a lot of actual Nazis?
Yeah.
Sort of.
Okay. Well, that's fair. That's a fair criticism, and I wasn't expect your opinion on that.
And so really that was one, and I feel, and you may know more about the actual constituency of the Green Party. What I know about is my perception of things from the people who tell me things, my sources inside and outside.
Mm-hmm.
The impression that I get, both from my experiences interviewing people in the Green Party and from talking to people who have had experiences outside the Green Party, is that there is a strong anti-vaxxer wing of the Green Party.
Yeah, there is.
And that Jill Stein doesn't want to piss them off.
Yeah, she doesn't. You're not wrong.
And I get that, and I understand that, and I know that's the reality. I wish that people would say that was the reality instead of making moral statements about vaccination and masking that play into anti-vaccine and anti-mask grievance myths.
Yeah, you're right about that.
And that's my biggest complaint about both the Green Party and the PSL, is that they are unwilling to stand up to the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers within their own ranks because they think it would be too difficult a topic. And whatever other problems they have, the Socialist Equality Party is willing to say, number one, hey, Nazis are bad. Despite their problems on class reductionism, they're willing to say Nazis are bad in a unproblematic way. And then the second thing is that they are willing to say, hey, shut up and wear a mask. I understand why people think shut up and wear a mask is authoritarian, but sometimes it's also the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
And I have lots of objections to the SEP and their website on small piddling things or on cultural things. And I don't believe that the cultural side of the argument is as unimportant as they sometimes believe it to be. But if they weren't ultimately on the right side of the cultural argument, they wouldn't say, don't, Nazis are bad, and shut up and wear a mask.
Yeah.
And so I understand their contradictions too, but at least they're willing to say those things.
Well, let me just say this for the Greens. I see the Green Party as an opportunity.
Well, and that's really the thing, is the Green Party has the ballot access.
It is very much a work in progress. And it is very much a work in progress that had decayed in progress, I think, for a while.
Well, so
and I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong in saying
I see the Greens the way I see the Democratic Party, which is a very well-constructed and genuinely well-meaning trap. That the people in the Greens have all the best intentions, but then I genuinely believe that the people in the Democrats have all the best intentions too.
Oh, I don't. You're nice.
No, I'm not saying that their policy is good.
I mean, but
I'm saying that they've convinced themselves that they're doing their thing, that their intentions are good. Whether the material consequences of their intentions are good is almost beside the point. They believe their intentions are good.
Well, I believe that there are a lot of Nazis that believe their intentions are good.
Well, but you see, and there's a whole nother discussion and how little difference there is between the Democrats and the Nazis. But
For
but
sure.
ultimately, the problems of the Green Party are the problems of the Democratic Party, but more liberal.
Right. And I'm attracted to it for that reason.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of people who want to be able to engage in politics, but
Sure.
can't stomach the duopoly. And
Sure.
I think people want a place to be heard, and it feels like the Green Party is hosting that.
Then the Green Party is better at giving people a place to be heard than a democratic centralist organization where you're supposed to toe the party line. Sure.
Mm-hmm,
and I get that.
Well, for a number of reasons. The fact that there's no fucking money. There's no money. Okay? Jill Stein's running around. There's no money. She's not making money. Nobody's making money. We're not getting money. I'll tell you that much. Okay? So we're doing this not for corporate reasons. And that makes a huge difference. And that's enough of a difference for me to want to get behind her. End of story.
There are class reasons.
The Green Party has major.
There are class reasons that the leadership of the Green Party can afford to run around not making money. And that's another argument.
I absolutely know that. But there are also class reasons why the SEP leadership can run around not making money.
Well, this is also true. This is also true. But the thing is that the difference is, though, is that the SEP...
The point is this:
makes money. You pay dues, and they don't deny it.
On the side of the workers, if we don't have privileged people on the side of the workers will never.
I see it both ways. I think it's good to have
the resources, and
I think it's good that there are privileged. I think it's good that there are privileged people saying the right things. I think there are always limits to how on the side of the workers privileged people can actually be unless they're constantly making a real effort that is very difficult to maintain 100% of the time.
I agree.
And as a result, there's always something a little bit suspect about people who run for office.
About men.
Yeah, sure. Of course.
And on that note, I love you so much.
I love you too. You have a great week.
I honestly enjoy every conversation I have with you, Chris. And this has been a good conversation too. And
I
could get into it, sure, about going between the SCP and the Greens, but we don't even have to because it's not that serious.
Well, that's the whole thing. It's not, because neither of them are going to win. And the reason neither of them are going to win is because they won't sit down and talk to each other about the things we're talking about.
Yeah. Well,
which is a whole nother topic for a whole show of its own sometime.
My message recently, and I'll say it again, is that I believe that there's an opportunity in the Greens for young people to get to a point where they are part of a political system where they were not allowed to be before. And I definitely believe that that's also the case for working class people in general with the Green Party. That again is enough of an opportunity for me to want to explore, at least this election with them. And so far, I've made some awesome friends. I got to say, there's a lot of people giving a lot of time and hard work to make.
I want to say that I support Christina Khalil's run for Senate.
Thank you.
I support.
I'll take it.
I would have to look more into detail to be sure, but I probably support most of the people that you have spoken to. Just knowing that you do your homework and aren't going to speak to the people who I would be, who I might be leery of. So I'm not. I hope I know what your principles are like. If you do speak to somebody, you'll challenge them.
Well, I hope I will. And maybe I'll chat with you about that before I do. Ammo.
And I support I support individual candidates and individual elections all over the place because, hey, this person is running and they're telling the truth and people need to hear it. But at the same time, I don't have a lot of hope for changes coming from elections until we've got the kinds of movements that can make people scared of the people, independent of their own built-in political institution. And really, the problem right now is not that the voters are tribalist the way that the media keeps telling us, but rather that our institutions are captured either by Democrats or Republicans or by quote unquote objective and apolitical people who are really just neither Democrats or Republicans, but certainly aren't considering anything further to the left of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And I think that gets lost a lot when people talk about, oh, well, our voters are so divided. Well, no, our voters aren't divided. Voters consistently say what they want.
Right.
Our political system is divided in that there is no one group that can unify around all the things that the voters want.
Right. Right.
And that's a problem of design.
Yep. That's a problem of class too.
Yes.
Sure. Yep. All right, buddy. It's been 2.5 hours.
It has. We need to go.
But this has been an awesome conversation, and thank you so much for having me today because your guest was amazing.
No, she's always amazing, and I am glad you were able to join us, and I hope that you have a great week.
You too.
And everybody else, you have a great week too, and we will tweet at you.
Okay.